Okay, so now we'll be looking at functions with conditionals inside of them. So this time we're going to include an if statement within this function, and it's actually going to be an if-else, and we're going to use the findMax function to do this. So this is basically just going to be a function that finds the maximum, but it first has to take in two numbers and has to do this test. So that's where the if statement comes in handy, because we test to see if one is greater than the other, and if it's not, then we'll return the other one. Okay, so now we've seen a variety of parameters and return types. So we've seen functions with nothing at all that just do perform just one basic function. We've seen functions with one parameter with multiple parameters, and we've seen functions with one return type and multiple return types, and even a combination of the three. So now let's take a look at functions that have conditionals inside of them. So this function is going to contain an if statement, and I'm going to use a max function to demonstrate this. Okay, so basically a max function is just going to take the maximum of two integers and return them, or return it. And in fact, I'm just going to word this better, and I'm just going to say return the max of two integers. Okay, so it's going to take in two integers as input parameters, and it's going to return one integer as an output parameter. Now in Swift there is a built-in max function, and it's basically just performing this task, but I want to show you exactly why functions are important and why they're so useful, and I think this is a good way to demonstrate it. So let's start out by creating this, and I'm going to call this max function, or rather findMax. It's going to take in two parameters as inputs. One is going to be number1, and I'm just going to have them both be integers. I could set them to be floats if I want, but it's kind of doing, for the sake of this tutorial, it's kind of doing the same thing. So just a side note, if you're creating this function to use in your code, you might want to have it take in doubles instead of integers, because that way you can pass in decimal numbers as well. And remember, for doubles, they don't have to be decimal numbers, they could be whole numbers. Doubles and floats just give you kind of a wider range of numbers because you can include non-whole numbers. Okay, so just a side note. And this is going to return an int. Okay, and because we just have the one return parameter, or the one return value, we don't need to specify a type. So remember, with the multiple, we had to give this a name like number3 and then the type, but this time we don't have to. Okay, and there we go. So we're set up. So it's taking two numbers, two integers, in number1 and number2, and it's going to return 1, which is going to be the maximum of these. Okay, so let's talk about if statements again. So hopefully you guys have watched the if statement tutorial by now. If not, then now might be a really good time to stop and watch it, just to get a basic idea of what we're doing. But simply put, if statements have an if, and then some kind of condition in these brackets here, and then some kind of code to execute if this condition is true, or rather if this test passes. So in this case, we want to say if number1 is greater than number2, then number2, there we go, then we want to return number1. Okay, and then else return number2. Okay, so what exactly is going on here? Well, we again take in two numbers, we're going to return 1. And so the first test is going to say, is number1 greater than number2? So let's say we put in a 5 and a 2. Well, we come across the statement and it's saying, is 5 greater than 2? Well, yes it is. So we're going to return 5 and then we're going to exit. And if that's not the case, if we have a 2 and a 5, then we will return the second one. Okay? Because obviously if number1 is not greater than number2, then it should be number2. Well, I guess we should also create the condition if they are equal. So, you know what? It doesn't really matter. Let's just have our function decide that if they're equal, we're just going to return number2. Okay, so this is basically if greater, return number 1, if less than or equal, return number 2. Okay, and the great thing about putting this return here is that if this is true and it returns, it's just going to exit the function. Okay, so we don't have to add in another return type at the bottom. Additionally, what we could do is we could create a constant saying let max number equal, you know, the maximum of these two, and then we could return the number, but it's kind of pointless. It's just an extra unnecessary step, and it takes up time and space in our playground. So let's just leave it as this. Okay, so let's go ahead and feed this in some values and see what happens. So we're going to give it a few different scenarios. So we're going to do find max on, let's do 20, I guess, and I wish that would go away, and 10. And what do we get returned? We get 20 returned here. Okay. How about if we did 30 and 10? Well, we'd still get 30. How about 5 and 10? We should get 10. And how about 10 and, well, 10 and 10, obviously we're going to get 10. Okay, well, cool. So the reason this is working is because we're comparing these two numbers. Again, in the first case, we had a 20 and a 10. So our first number was greater than the second number, so this test passed, and so we returned number 1. Okay. For the third case, we had a 5 and a 10. And when this was true, then our first test failed, because 5 is no longer greater than 10, and so we returned number 2. So we skipped over this code here, and we performed this code, which was just returning the second number. Okay, so that's an example of a function with an if statement, the find max, and we can do the same for find min, where it's just the other way around, where we just flip this around and change this to find min. Okay? So yeah, this is a prime example of why functions are so great rather than having to type this out every time. Because what I can do is I can call this find max as many times as I want, and all it is a simple one line of code. And in fact, I hardly even have to type anything. I can just start typing it, press enter, and it kind of fills it in for me already. However, if I were to perform this test every single time with two numbers, then it would get really tedious, and if I had to do this 100 times, I would get annoyed. So this is a really good example of why functions are so useful, because we can perform these big long tasks, these big tests, using just one line of code here. Okay, so that's the find max function for you. Again, just testing a conditional. We took in two numbers, two integers, we're returning 1, and we just kind of tested to see which one was greater. If number 1 was greater, we return number 1. If number 2 was greater, we return number 2. Okay, so that's an if statement inside of a function. Now we'll be taking a look at for loops inside of functions. Alright, so now we looked at functions with conditionals inside of them. So we used this find max function, which basically just took in two input numbers, so two integers, and returned one integer. And that integer was the results of the greater than test. So we first tested if the first number is greater than the second one and returned it if it was. And then if it wasn't, then we just said return the second number. Okay, so this is a good example of a conditional within a function. And it's also a good example of how functions make our lives easier and more efficient. So with just one line of code, we could perform the same task as we'd have to do using, 4 or 5 different lines of code. So if we wanted to perform this max test over and over again, it's a really good idea to kind of create this maximum function rather than writing out this complex if statement many times. Okay, so and that's really the beauty of functions, is that they allow you to perform these big tasks with only like 1 or 2 lines of code.